Good morning, gentlemen. It's a wonderful weather, and I'm going to talk to you about a man who just passed away about 2 days back. Many would consider him to be a legend, and many consider that he was a war criminal. Now, let's examine what exactly he was, and his name is Henry Kissinger. He was the principal security advisor of the American government and then the Secretary of State from 67 to 78. And he served two presidents, that is Richard Nixon and Gerald Ford. And he has lived up to the ripe old age of 100 and passed away in bed. Gentlemen, Henry Kissinger is a phenomenon. He was born in Germany in 1923, and that's 100 years back. And he was of Jewish origin, that being the reason he had no choice but to leave Germany after 1933 when Adolf Hitler seized power. There was discrimination against the Jews. He went to America, joined the American army, fought against the Germans. After the war, he got his education and lived a general good life, married twice. And overall, I thought he was a wonderful chap. But that's about where the comparison ends, because the crucial period of his life was the 10 years he spent as the National Security Advisor and then later the Secretary of State. The policies that he formulated at that time have become an anchor around the neck of the American presidents and the American governments. And he is the man, in my opinion, who facilitated the rise of China. His love for China can be seen from the fact that just after he had crossed his 100th birthday, he made a visit to China again, and the Chinese gave him a lot of respect. Well, they should, because he's the one man who made China, and now the situation is that the Americans are confronted with a Frankenstein. You all know the famous novel by Percy Shelley, Frankenstein, where a scientist creates an ogre, and that man becomes the nemesis of mankind. He is Frankenstein. I think the credit for creation of China into an ogre and a dragon which will terrorize the world goes to Henry Kissinger. We'll have to examine his life in toto. Many have said that he's a war criminal. As I said, I wouldn't consider him a war criminal. But one of the things that has gone against him is the fact that he advocated the carpet bombing of civilians in Vietnam, and there was a spillover effect, and Cambodia and Laos were also bombed. Hundreds and thousands died. I think he was a believer in Gulliad the Hood's theory that you can win a war by strategic bombardment, carpet bombing. I think the Hood was wrong there, because he hadn't come to know about the resilience of the Vietnamese army. But during his stint as the principal security advisor to the president, he probably realized that the time had come when America must disengage from Vietnam. That was one. Secondly, he realized that if America has to dominate the world, it must keep China as an ally. Now, how these two ideas came into his mind, I really have no idea. America, of course, been friends with China right from the beginning, and they were very close to the Kuomintang regime, which was headed by General Chiang Kai-shek. And after 1945, when the Civil War broke out between the communists and the nationalists, the Americans were on the side of the Kuomintang, that is the nationalists. They lost. That's another story. And Chiang Kai-shek went and holed up in an island called Formosa. But the Americans carried out a make-believe, a pretense that the real China is the nationalist China, that is Formosa, and they ignored communist China totally, and this continued for a good part of 2 decades. Gentlemen, now the point to be noted here is that America had to reverse that policy. And why did they reverse it? Now that is a crucial factor. There are two characters involved in this, and one is Henry Kissinger, who was then principal advisor as well as the Secretary of State later, and the second is Richard Nixon. I think Nixon is known as Tricky Dick, but he turned out to be too tricky ultimately, and he had to resign his presidentship or face impeachment because of the Watergate scandal. I won't go into that. But anyway, he went away and Ford took over, and he kept our good friend Henry Kissinger in this chair as the Secretary of State. Now, the thinking of his mind cannot be unraveled now, but he did travel on a secret visit to China, and he took over from one of the Pakistani airfields, went and met Bao Zedong and others and made some proposals. Now, the Chinese had been feeling isolated for a long time, that is the Red Chinese, the mainland Chinese, and they're looking for an opening, a way out. How do they get out of the poverty? How do they become a great power back it is? And they got a man like Kissinger who swallowed everything the Chinese told him, hook, line and sinker, and sadly, he got taken in by the Chinese and he committed a lot more than he got. He agreed that America would disengage from Vietnam, that is one. Number two, he also extracted a promise from the Chinese that they would not destabilize the South Vietnam government. And he also accepted a one China policy, that there would be only one China, and the people's, the nationalist state which is in Formosa will never have the recognition of being that one China. But he got a promise that, well, we will not try to uniform Formosa by force. Now the Chinese have not kept these promises, but at that time Kissinger thought he scored a very big coup, and this gentleman then paved the way for the visit of Richard Nixon to Beijing. I think this visit has already been talked about quite a bit. I won't go into it in detail, except that it was like going and paying obeisance to the emperor, that is Mao Zedong, and China once more felt they were like the ancient civilization when they were the Middle Kingdom, and all the kings came and reported to the emperor in China. Gentlemen, this is a very, very important point, because when Nixon went there, he gave in so many things and got nothing in return. In fact, as is a well-known fact, for the days Nixon was in China, the 7th fleet were withdrawn from the South China Sea, the Eastern Pacific. Now, why should he do that? But he did it. The Chinese are very clever. Why they should not be clever? Because they got a civilization of 4,000 years. 4,000 years is a long time. In America, it's just a kindergarten nation in there compared to them. They couldn't fathom the Chinese mind, and least of all Henry Kissinger, who had his own axe to grind. Another thing that propelled Kissinger to normalize relations with communist China was, and that was the big business in America. They were chaffing, they were wanted a big market, and they felt China is the market. China at that time was the most populous country in the world, and they thought, what a wonderful market it is. If we can manufacture goods there, sell them, everything would be honky-dory. So, our good friend Richard Nixon then made a visit to China, and the doors were opened, and billions of dollars of American assistance, American investment went into China. The Chinese began to lap up this very well, and they made a pretense that they would do everything what the Americans wanted. But it was not long, just after Richard Nixon came back, that there was the battle in Vietnam, and South Vietnam was run over completely by the North Vietnamese, and that is one of the historical facts. So that is where our friend Kissinger was proved wrong to start with. But he didn't think that he'd done anything mistake, because he had thought that China would be partnering America as the junior partner and dominate the world. Now, it's easier said than done. China is not going to be junior partner to anybody. He was also responsible for a lot of killings and massacres which went on in the Gaza Strip, And then came the 73 war, in which he again sided with the Arabs, and the Israelis had to stop the fight. And for that, he got the Nobel Prize. And it's a sad commentary that the man who had advocated car bombing and thousands of innocent people had been killed was given the Nobel Prize. But as I said, there was no indictment made against him, and he continued having a ball all over. Now, American industry flooded China, big corporations, Apple, all of them, they went to China, billions of dollars came in. The Americans, Chinese were very clever. They began to do something called reverse engineering, and they reverse engineered most of the American products and produced them as their own. And there is a fact of history that a thing which should have been done in 90 years or maybe 80 years, the Chinese were able to cover the whole thing up within just 2 decades. Just 2 decades. And very soon, China was catching up to the United States. And the credit for this must go, of course, to Mr. Henry Kissinger. Kissinger finally demitted office, went away, but his thinking didn't change. He was mostly anti-India. I won't discuss that point here at the moment because it's not relevant to his actions with China, with vis-a-vis China. But the fact remains that Henry Kissinger, if he had not appeared on the scene, the Americans would have been better off. But here was a man who had his own fixed notions about China. He had, I don't know, fond love for China. And he kept on having that love right up to 2023 when he made his last visit to China. I have read his books in which he justifies throwing in the towel to China. At the same time, it brought the Americans into very bad light and became apparent that when the chips are down, America does not stand by its allies. They dropped Chiang Kai-shek like a hot potato, and he sank in the Eastern Pacific. At the same time, they extracted some provinces for China that they wouldn't attack Taiwan. But now the Chinese are belligerent and they're building up their amphibious capability. And I can assure gentlemen, you all, that once the Chinese have built up their amphibious capability, the one China principle is going to be the anchor around the neck of the American leadership, because China is going to mount an invasion of Formosa, which even the Americans have recognized as part of China, and the only real China is communist China. And for this, the only man who can be thanked is Henry Kissinger. So Kissinger was a very, very volatile man, but I'll say he was a very brilliant man. Nobody can detract that from his capability. But a brilliant man can be a genius, both evil and bad. And I thought he was a bit of a evil genius in the sense he didn't realize that he was creating a Frankenstein in China. Richard Nixon, the less said about him the better. He's one of the disgraced presidents in America, and he's the one who made that momentous visit to China, threw in the towel, and there are photographs of him sitting and drinking toasts with the Chinese Prime Minister Zhou Enlai and Mao Zedong. It's very sad. That was the day when America gave up the leadership of the world. I don't have anything more to add about Henry Kissinger, gentlemen. Kissinger is not a war criminal, I'll accept that, but his effect on the American policy has been very deleterious, and America is going to pay a very heavy price for the antics of Mr. Kissinger. The American industry now doesn't know what to do. There's a trade imbalance with China of almost $400 to $500 billion, and America is at its end of the tether. They don't know what to do. There's a war on in Ukraine, there's a war on in Gaza, and the Americans don't have any allies, and they have created the Frankenstein China, which has gone and joined Russia. Gentlemen, these are all past thoughts, because we can now assess what Henry Kissinger did. I think he's the one man who have brought America to the nadir. And if tomorrow the Americans are destroyed and the civilization suffers, the credit for it will go to Richard Nixon and Henry Kissinger. Well, gentlemen, I hope you like this channel. Share it with your friends, and I look forward to more interaction with you. In the meanwhile, I'll say goodbye. Glory to India, and God bless you all. Take care and come back again for more.